So, welcome. Thank you for joining me. And we are in a position, as I was just explaining before I hit record, where we can go in pretty much any direction. Although there is quite a specific theme that I want to highlight, and that might also at the same time enable us to go in pretty much any direction. So I titled the session What Doesn't Change, to a certain extent provocatively, because I like to talk about the history and philosophy of yoga, in which there is really an ongoing process of evolution. I've got a new book coming out entitled The Evolution of Modern Yoga, and the whole point of what I've tried to gather together there from the work of scholars who look at yoga history is that nothing really stays the same in some ways. And yet at the same time, there are quite strong continuities that enable us to speak of something called yoga. And if there weren't, it might be very difficult to do so. And just as I was thinking about how I might start the conversation, I picked up a rather old book from my shelf titled The Sacred Thread by John Brockington, who has been based, I think, in Edinburgh as a teacher, but is now in Oxford and has contributed quite a bit to the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, where I also work from time to time. And the very end of his book, summing it all up, the subtitle is Hinduism in its Continuity and Diversity. I mean, he's speaking specifically about Hinduism, but I think what he says applies also to yoga, which is not exclusive to Hinduism. And the last couple of lines are as follows. The ability to adapt itself to changing circumstances has been a mark of Hinduism throughout its history, and the unifying factor bringing together its many diverse threads lies in their common history within this unique weaving together of tradition and innovation. Hinduism is ever the same, yet different. And in some ways, that's the basic idea that I want to highlight, that yoga is a phenomenon that exists in a context, and contexts change. There are many different varieties of yoga. There have been throughout its history. And yet, perhaps there are still some things that keep it woven together under the heading of yoga. And perhaps if there weren't, it might be very difficult to talk about yoga. So my aim is to highlight a little bit of that and then to invite some conversation on the subject. So I'm going to go ahead, pull up some slides. I'll talk for as little as I can, maybe 15 minutes or so, just to throw some ideas out there. Then I'll open it all up to everyone who's present and see if you have questions, and perhaps we can have some discussion in smaller groups together. So here goes. What doesn't change? Well, in the presentations of yoga philosophy that we find in some of the foundational texts that teach yogic practices, there is quite a lot that is said not to change. In some senses, the whole aim of yoga practice is to transcend time and space and to be in some infinite eternality, which is not subject to change. And I think it's very important to bring that forward right at the beginning, because that is a consistent theme of many texts about yogic practice over many centuries. It might not be so much to the fore in the average modern yoga studio, however, pointing towards the timeless, the eternal, the transcendent. It's often rather this worldly in terms of what to do with body parts in postural classes, and maybe a few other techniques creeping in around the margins. But consistently in earlier presentations, we find things like this. So this is a random example to a certain extent, mainly because there's three verses in close proximity in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita that summarize a lot of the ideas that are found in the early Upanishads, where really this philosophy first gets presented, at least in texts that become associated with yoga practice. Similar ideas you find in other traditions as well. And whether or not they point to something that is timeless and eternal, they're all in some way trying to deal with the problem of things that change in a never-ending cycle, that needs in some way to be stopped, transcended, somehow engaged with, to give us some degree of self-control. And the thing that is revealed, says the Gita, if you are successful in seeing clearly, is that you are not your mind or your body, but instead something that is eternal, that is found in an embodied experience, but that does not get destroyed when the body falls to pieces. Bodies are finite, but this eternal embodied soul is indestructible. It's also beyond comprehension, partly because language is bound in some way by time and space and specificity, whereas this Atman, the transcendent essence of the possibility that yoga is pointing towards, is not something that exists bound in time and space, but is never born, never dies, animating things that are here, but also animating everything that will ever come into existence, and at the same time, therefore, eternal, everlasting. So that's the kind of things that have been said consistently about the objective of yoga practice, to come into an awareness of oneself as awareness. And that is just present in things that are aware. And when the container for the awareness falls to pieces, awareness continues. So that's the basic framework that all of these traditions have been using. And at the same time, that's quite a lofty goal. And it's described in other contexts as immortality. Because if it's unchanging, if it's timeless, if it's always present, if it's just the thing that is, the pure isness of being, well, it's not subject to birth and death. And therefore, the aim of yoga is to become immortal. And everything else that we might otherwise get distracted by is to be avoided to a certain extent. A lot of early yoga teachings emphasizing retreat from the world, renunciation of the world. Certainly the prioritization of an engagement with this timeless possibility within, and disengagement from that which is changing, which is sucking us into engagement with the world out there, trying to get stuff, to get satisfied. And the Katha Upanishad, which is the earliest of the Upanishads to really define yoga as a state beyond the mind, when everything is brought under control so there is no more distraction, is basically saying you're looking for this thing that doesn't change. The things that do change will confuse you. You will not find the unending peace if you get caught up in the mind, the body, the world, all things that you might seek out there in search of satisfaction. So yoga practice repeatedly aiming inwards rather than outwards, and that seems to be a fairly consistent message, at least early on. But as I was alluding to, things do change, and we need to see how that affects objectives. If we come to the modern era, which we're all a lot more familiar with, people are less interested in turning away from the mind and the body, at least in the long run, maybe for a brief moment or on a retreat or in some other form of practice where they turn inwards. But generally speaking, what most people think of as yoga is doing things with the body to feel better in the body and feel happier in life and getting on with being entangled in all that changes. And the presentation of yoga as something associated with health and well-being is the foundation of the Indian government's promotion of the International Day of Yoga. There's a quote there from the Prime Minister Narendra Modi at his United Nations speech that pressed for the inauguration of this now 12 years ago, saying, yes, it's ancient, it's invaluable, it's very traditional, but it's also about health and well-being. There are no references to yoga for health and well-being in ancient texts. There's certainly no reference to the idea of practicing for a hashtag Fit India, which was one of the slogans adopted for the 2018 International Day of Yoga, let alone a 3D AI avatar of the Prime Minister doing his asana practice. All this idea of doing things with the body to feel better in the body has really come about in the last couple of 100 years. So, how did we end up going from one thing to another? That is a big change. And how does that work with this whole framework of things not changing? Well, crudely speaking, it's not really possible to talk about continuity in terms of physical yoga practice. To begin with, there was none of what you see on the right, which people today in the average postural yoga practice context are very familiar with, whether or not they practice Ashtanga Vinyasa, which is the source of these pictures from the primary series. They are aware of the idea of putting body into shapes being something that is identified as yoga. Now, really, the only shape that anybody was putting their body into back at the time I was talking about in the descriptions in early texts such as the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita was either a very uncomfortable position, like the one adopted by the guy on the left, an ascetic who's decided to hold his arm up and never bring it down, or the seated meditative position that is really the only asana that is taught until about 1,000 years ago. And in the last 1,000 years, the number of asanas presented has got more, diverse and numerous. And at the same time, the focus on asana has become more pronounced. So instead of the whole idea being what you see on the left, ignoring the body, ignoring its discomforts, deliberately doing something really painful so that you can deliberately ignore how painful it is and turn away from the senses screaming, give me satisfaction, and instead rest inside in this timeless presence. It's now become all about doing things that make us feel better in the body to a certain extent. There's obviously no obstacle to practicing asana as part of a system that leads towards something else. And certainly some teachers today do teach in that way. But for the large part, what is known to the masses as yoga is making shapes on mats. And they have different objectives. So not only have the methods changed, the objectives have changed. It's about this worldly benefits. It's about how one feels in the sense of mental and physical health in order to be more effective in worldly affairs, and to even at some level bring it down to just trying to look good might be a reason that people go to yoga classes, to get in shape. Whereas the guy on the left is actually actively destroying the body rather than cultivating it. So there's an enormous disparity there between the orientation of the practitioner, but also the methodology used. Although some might find some approaches to modern postural yoga quite ascetic, they're not really doing the same thing. They might be bringing a little bit of that into the equation, perhaps staying in a position beyond where it feels like it's fun, but that's really the end of it. So there's a disparity there. There's not so much of a continuity. And that really is observable when we look at this word asana. So much to the fore in modern yoga, so much identified with all sorts of contortions, but it really just does mean sitting. The verbal root as means to sit, and asana is either what you sit on or the position in which you sit. And that's what it means for the first, we don't know how many 1,000 years of yoga history, potentially. Certainly well into the Common Era, certainly up to about 1,000 years ago is the first time the word asana is associated with a different position than sitting. Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra that people like to quote today as if it's the Yoga Bible and somehow compatible with the postural yoga presentation, he doesn't really talk about making shapes in any way. He just says, you get into a comfortable and steady position if you stop trying to be comfortable, basically. If you stop making an effort and you become absorbed in the infinite. There we are again, this timeless, eternal realm. If you can do that, then you are not troubled by what is called the dualities, the dvandvas of opposites. And those opposites are clarified in a accompanying commentary as being basically things that are uncomfortable. So the whole idea of asana as presented by Patanjali in the best known text of yoga philosophy is the same as holding your arm in the air, effectively. It's don't care if it's comfortable. You become comfortable when you ignore the pain and just get absorbed in what you're meant to be doing rather than adjusting your position or trying to actively have a comfortable position. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that is the orientation of the Yoga Sutra. It is quite world renouncing, it is quite ascetic, and yet it's somehow made to cohere with modern postural yoga. How does that work? Well, that's a big topic that we maybe don't have time for right now. But I think one of the reasons that the two are joined together is because that word asana is part of Patanjali's 8-part framework that people today like to talk about. So there's a suggestion that it's very traditional, very ancient to do some kind of postural practice, and that that's well on the way to a path to liberation. Well, it could be, but only if you incorporate all the other things that Patanjali is describing about the nature of ignorance, the problems of the mind, and what to do about it. So I'm highlighting here some very strong discontinuity in order to give us something to think about what needs to be connected somehow. There is something that's become very different, and yet there are still texts, there are still ideas from ancient India that have relevance, including many in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. So I think it helps to come back to basics, partly again to illustrate the difference, but also to start to think about common threads. What is yoga? Well, we could spend at least an hour just talking about that, if not a whole course. But there is the earliest definition I was talking about from the Katha Upanishad, reining in the mind and the senses. That's yoga. It's a state of being. It's not actually a practice. And the whole point of the reining in actually is to enable a separation, really, a separation of the eternal from that which is changing, from the world, from the mind, the body, the senses, stuff out there. And so it's not the case that yoga means union, even in many early presentations, certainly not in Patanjali's either. And yet in the modern world, you go to an example here from Yoga Journal, which was an article written by famous modern teacher Donna Farhi, and describing what many people say. Yoga is the unification of body, mind, and spirit. And the Latin word spiritus meant breath. You could talk about the unification of body, mind, and breath, but you will not find an ancient Indian source that says anything of the sort. In fact, if you go to Patanjali again, he'll talk about the separation of the spirit from the body and the mind. So it's complicated, this yoga history stuff, and yet there is still yoga in presentations of an integrated practice that unifies the body, the mind, and the breath in the practice of asanas. And that connecting thread is more to do with the idea of yoga as concentration, as focus, as disciplined effort in the sense of being able to hold the mind on an object of concentration, meditation, reflection, contemplation. That ability is what early yogis were training. And one can do that through making shapes on mats. It gets easier when one also incorporates the engagement with the flow of the breath and even where one is pacing one's gaze. So there are many ways in which continuities can be found, but they are not automatically there just because the word yoga is used. So I like to think that it's helpful to start trying to see where there are these disparities and to start exploring how bridges might be built by finding core principles that enable some kind of connecting thread to be maintained. To underline with Patanjali why he's not saying yoga means union, just in case this is not new, sorry, this is new to you and not something you're familiar with, it's absolutely foundational to the philosophy of early yoga that the witnessing presence within needs to be somehow extracted from its surroundings. So in the earliest text to define yoga, in the way that we've just seen, the Katha Upanishad, the Purusha, the name for the true self, that is literally a person that is so small it's hidden away in the heart, needs to be somehow extricated from its surroundings. Something needs to be done to reveal it in its splendor that is immortal and bright. Similarly for Patanjali, the whole cause of suffering is getting your innermost seer entangled in the stuff of the world. Removal of your confusion ends that conjunction leads instead to the separation of the Purusha from Prakriti, its surroundings. And so, in that sense, the philosophy of yoga has also changed a great deal. There are many different philosophies of yoga. There's not only Patanjali's, and in fact, his Sankhya based dualistic framework really falls by the wayside. It tends to get colonized in modern presentations by non dual philosophies of Tantra and Vedanta that over the centuries did become associated with yoga practice. But it gets very hard to speak about yoga when there are so many different ways of looking at it. And one of the things I've said about it in one of my earlier books, The Truth of Yoga, is that actually it becomes very helpful to start to realize that there isn't such a thing as one yoga tradition. In fact, there isn't really a way of saying that any of these ways of presenting yoga is more authentic than others. They're just different. They're just combining some of the raw materials that are used to make practice frameworks and theoretical explanations in slightly different ways. And so in that earlier book, I tried to isolate some of those components into small digestible chapters to enable us as modern practitioners to think about what gets mixed and matched and how we might find some building blocks from older sources that are still alive in what we're doing and perhaps give us some foundation for that connecting thread I was talking about. In my new book that's coming out shortly, The Evolution of Modern Yoga, I really look at how some of the innovative teachers of the early 20th century were very concerned to be very specific in what they were doing to make sure that that connecting thread was in place. So they were very consciously innovating, although they quite often disguised that. But at the same time, they were also very conscious about trying to maintain some degree of connection with previous traditions. And that sort of dynamic interaction between the old and the new is really the essence of how yoga evolves. But since we're changing it by engaging with it, I think it's important that we think about what those connecting threads might be and do our best to ensure that they're in place. And there are many potential places that we could look for them. I don't want to name too many of them because I'd like to open this up for a group exploration. But just one that comes to mind to me is that if we really dig deep into what yoga philosophy has pretty consistently been pointing towards, when it's talking about this timeless, unchanging being that is sort of outside of time, it is really pointing away from the self-centeredness that leads us into confusion. All yoga traditions are really trying to solve a problem of wrong knowledge, avidya, not knowing the wrong things and thinking they're right, and instead to lead towards true knowledge. And this wrong knowledge is all caught up with the idea of me, and the liberating insight is to be effectively free from the idea of me, to be no longer living this personalized experience of likes and dislikes, to actually be absolutely okay with anything just the way it is. And the Mahabharata there summing that up, perfection from 2,000 years ago. People who are wise, this is the basis of what the Bhagavad Gita says, Bhagavad Gita being a subset of the Mahabharata. They're not happy about getting stuff. They're not sad when they don't get stuff because they are not thinking about themselves as individuals who need things to be happy. Instead, they are content with the simplicity of being and see everything as equal. Good, bad, same. Nothing about preference or needs, content with the world as it is. And that idea is still alive, in all sorts of forms today, even if in your average yoga class, the teacher doesn't start the class by saying, right, we're going to sit down today before we begin and remind ourselves the problem is you. They might not have many students were they to do so, but George Harrison on the last Beatles album, Let It Be, sang a song all about this never-ending internal monologue that says all through the day, I, me, mine, I, me, mine, I, me, mine, and points out that we're all very attached to that, really, frightened of leaving it. Everyone's weaving it, coming on strong all the time. So something that points beyond me is a very strong foundation of yoga practice. But as I emphasize, not necessarily where rather self-centered and performative approaches to a fixation on what the body can do are often leading in the modern yoga context. So I'm going to leave it there for now and open it up to you and start thinking about what might be consistent when so much has changed throughout the history of yoga. A very brief summary there of that, but many things I'm sure we can imagine for ourselves. But before we get into exploring possible threads of continuity, I just wonder, does anybody have any questions or anything that they would like to raise in response to what I was saying there? Please do feel free to disagree or to share anything that came to mind while you were listening. So you're welcome to just unmute and speak. We're a small enough group that I can see you. Or if you would prefer to type in the chat, that's also fine. Otherwise, I'll turn the questions back to you.
Hi.
Yes, Ivo.
Hi. Your second quote from the new book
Hmm.
sounded positive, but you can also maybe look at it like claim to authority to then, yeah, say your new finding is somehow true because it has that claim. How do you look at that?
That's a great point. And I think to a certain extent, that's what yoga teachers who were innovating were somewhat afraid of. Let me bring this up to illustrate, just in case that quote isn't foremost in anyone's mind. So, yeah, I wanted to emphasize two things there. I mean, you see there's a little bit missed out with the ellipsis, the three dots. That we are under no obligation to try and take one text from the past and make it our yoga Bible. In fact, I don't think there is a yoga text that anybody would be able to embody 100% because they're written for different times and places. They are context specific. And what keeps yoga relevant is the fact that people do innovate. But if we run away with that too far, yes, it's very easy to just become caught up in more avidya, self-deluding, telling ourselves this is a great yoga innovation because it's something that will make money or will enable us to have lots of students and feel important or whatever it might be. And that doesn't necessarily have any connection to the past. And the distinction I wanted to underline there was that a lot of these innovators who did things that were very different and perhaps didn't admit it were trying actually to do what has been consistently encouraged in Indian traditions, which is not to make it all about me and say, hey, look at my great new invention, but to just say, as happens in commentaries, there's something here in an older idea that I've managed to just interpret slightly differently. And these are the reasons why it's still very consistent with the old idea. And if you go about your innovation that way, you can basically turn things 180 degrees around in the opposite direction. But if you can somehow make it sound like it has this connection back to the past, then there is this possibility of continuing the idea that it's all timeless. And that's a fairly consistent way that traditions innovate within ancient Indian contexts and as recently as the early 20th century. But for me, the problem with that is it makes it hard to see what's new. And as you say, it also enables people to pretend things are very old and perhaps even mislead students in the process. And I think it's a lot more helpful, especially for ourselves now moving forwards, to be clearer about what we're doing that's changing things, to be clear about what's new, but at the same time to try and do what some of those innovators were doing and to think about how, when we're making things new, we're also trying to keep some of the old, at least the principles behind the old, alive. So one very simple example that probably makes it clear is if we go back to the beginning of yoga history, the whole idea was to escape from a cycle of births. You go to the average modern yoga studio and ask who came to class to avoid being reborn, you're not going to get many people who say yes. But the idea behind samsara and the problems that yoga and other traditions were trying to resolve is that it is of its very nature to suffer through this cycle of endless rebirth. This is the nature of dukkha. And so if we think about the aim of yoga as being to alleviate the problem of suffering, Well, then, even yoga for health and well-being does have some connecting thread back to that principle. But we need to think about what was the other idea, which was also, yeah, it's not about getting more attached to the body, more attached to the idea of me, and more attached to, aren't I great as a result of doing it? And that very easily happens in body-focused, health and wellness culture. So it would be also quite helpful to remember that one of the other important principles is perhaps, seeing beyond this body focused, self centered understanding of who we are. And I think you could do both of those things in a modern postural yoga class and have everybody think, yeah, that's great. I'm totally on board with this. But you probably wouldn't advertise it that way on the timetable. But that's how skillful teachers who I've had the fortune to study with have presented it to me. And I think that's possible to carry on that way. Does that clarify, or is that adding more confusion?
Oh, that's a nice explanation of ways to look at it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Any other thoughts anyone would like to share or questions that you'd like to raise? Yeah, Floris. Hmm.
Yeah, hello everyone. So when I read your publication for this event, for some reason, I don't know why, perhaps I read it completely wrong, but I was thinking about uh, the difference between doing something to reach the state of yoga and to stop doing something to reach the state of yoga. Could
Hmm.
you perhaps talk a bit about that from a historical perspective and how that perhaps changed over time?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. And I think to some extent, I was sort of thinking of going in that direction. And the way in which I could have jumped off there would have been when we looked at the definition of yoga as a state. Um, for Patanjali and for the previous 1,000 years, really, the definition of yoga was usually in terms of a way of being, a way of seeing, a state in which there was no more distraction, there was just clarity. And the idea of practice is to make that state come about. But the practice itself wasn't so often identified as yoga, although to a certain extent that state is brought about by being in that state. So there is a mixture of method and objective tied up in the name. But in the modern world, especially when we think about postural practice being identified as yoga, people are always talking about doing yoga or going to yoga where I practice yoga. And I think it's quite helpful to be reminded of the fact that much of the early history of yoga was about the outcome rather than the method. And there were many different methods that could lead to the outcome. So you get these Sanskrit compounds in which things like karma, action, are associated with yoga. So getting into the yoga state through action, karma yoga, through devotion, bhakti yoga. So there's that possibility of seeing it that way. And I think what comes from that is to remember that it's actually the whole problem that these early yogis were trying to address was the problem that arises from doing. The cycle of samsara is driven by karma, by action. And action being a cyclical process is related to the mind, it's related to desire, because we want stuff, so we try to get it, and then whether or not we get it affects how our mental state is and conditions the next desire, effectively. That's how it was first described. And so the whole idea was to stop wanting and stop doing, and that would put you into this state as you slowly unwound the psychological effects of the outcomes of previous actions, etc., etc. And I think then it's quite helpful to think about the need to be more focused on undoing than doing if we're interested in trying to reveal what is there all the time anyway, this timeless presence in which we can rest. Because the more we're focused on doing, it's a bit like, having the phone in front of the face. There's a constant distraction. It's this, it's this. We become very result oriented and forward in, our momentum, which is basically the same thing as the problem of karma. The cycle spins, it spins on and on through this lifetime and into the next. Whereas the idea of yoga is to unwind that cycle. So, in a way, we're trying to unwind the unhelpful conditioning that leads us deeper into confusion and suffering. And that requires us perhaps to do some things, but it's also about not doing the things that are the patterns that create the confusion and the distraction. So I think it's quite helpful to see, as you were suggesting, a difference between doing and being there, and yoga being much more about being. Um, Perhaps some practice needs to be done to bring about the awareness of the being, but it's useful, I think, to perhaps keep yoga more associated with the being and have another word like postures or whatever it might be for the method. And I think that would lead to a lot less confusion in the modern yoga world about actually what yoga was about. Okay, any other reflections, or would you like to have a chat about what might remain consistent over the history of yoga? Yes, Eric, before we dive in.
Yeah, that's the reason why I joined this
Hmm.
conversation. What is the timeless, the eternal? What can I think about that? I mean, everything is changing. Maybe the laws of nature are kind of consistent in a way, but what is there that could be timeless or motionless? This I don't understand.
It's a great question. Yeah. I mean, I think the laws of nature are a very good thing to come back into a sort of grounded, immediately relatable relationship with in order to have some handle on it. But in Indian tradition, it's the objective of yoga to reveal the true self, which is consciousness. And consciousness just is. It's not really even as yet fully explained by science in its attempts to make sense of the natural world. There's an assumption that it somehow arises from materiality that's been the dominant paradigm. There are others related more to Indian philosophy that see the other way round, that consciousness is the field in which everything arises. But one way or another, the simple fact is that it is. And that's actually the only thing that's said about the nature of this self, this Atman, in the Katha Upanishad when describing what it is that yoga practice might reveal. It is simply asti, the third person singular of the verb to be. It is. It is. And so the isness of being is really all that is unchanging in that sense. But as soon as we personalize it and make it about me being in this body with these characteristics and this identity, of course, that's not eternal. Nobody lives forever. The body dies. But if we could inhabit our mind body system with a little bit more time spent in the slightly less personal realm that's closer to the isness, we might have a little less concern about the fact that the body falls to pieces and that we don't live forever. Does that answer the question, or is that still slightly
Very
missing the
good
point?
point. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Raphael.
Hi. Yeah, something I would consider timeless is the human desire to overcome suffering and
Hmm.
to gain happiness. And for me personally, this is basically at the core of what I consider for myself yoga and is what is important for me in my yoga practice.
Fantastic point. Thank you. I mean, there would be no yoga were it not for that impulse. The earliest Indian texts, the Vedic hymns, they don't talk about this problem of suffering. They don't talk about the cycle of births. They don't talk about the quest for liberation. They don't talk about yoga. This emerges somewhere from an unknown source between 3,000 and 2,500 years ago, at least in far as we can trace it through texts. Yeah, maybe older, who knows? But it certainly doesn't appear in that earliest presentation. So, at some point, people started to understand their own relationship to being in a way that was problematic, and realizing that we are conditioned in a way that can make us suffer more, and that there's also things we can do that make us suffer less. And so, yeah, I think that is a very important, consistent principle. And as I was suggesting, it still can be allied to presenting yoga for well-being, but maybe there are some other principles that might need to be there too. So, on that basis, I'm going to suggest that we maybe have a chat in some smaller groups. I'd like to invite you to talk to each other just for a little bit. And there's no obligation, of course. If you don't want to be part of a smaller group, that's fine. So I'll make some breakout rooms with enough people in them that you're welcome to sit in one and be a silent participant and listen to the others if you prefer. But I think it would be a fun opportunity just to have, if nothing else, a quick circulation around the room and to say one thing that you think might be consistent in the history of yoga or the way that people practice. And it may be that you disagree with each other. If so, so much the better. I look forward to hearing about it. But I'm going to invite you to just exchange a few thoughts on that front, and then we'll reconvene and compare notes. So you'll get an invitation now. As I say, it's not compulsory, but yeah, I invite you to explore. And you're welcome, as I say, to be part of a group and just be a listener rather than a speaker, if that makes you more comfortable. So you should have a notification. We'll meet back here shortly. I'll send you a message when time's up. So welcome back. We'll have the others joining us shortly, but I'm curious what came up in your discussion, Cami, Matthew. Would either of you like to share anything?
So I'm happy to
Feel
share
free.
what we discussed about,
Hmm.
what we chatted about. So we chatted about how basically our relationship to yoga and how basically yoga is answering some needs, some soul searching. How is it ever evolving?
Hmm.
There were a lot of thoughts as well around the breath and the constant presence of the breath and observing the breath through the practice of yoga as asana practice, but also through meditation.
Hmm.
So yeah, that were the main thoughts about basically using yoga. Also, especially Matthew highlighted, and I found that quite interesting. That especially in the context of constant crisis and ever changes around in the context in which we're evolving, it's interesting to have a practice to come back to, regardless of its form, because it brings some routine and some a place to come back to, so to say.
Thank you, Cami. Yeah, that's a great point, and that makes me think of another way of responding to Eric's earlier question, about what might be unchanging, and I think it could even just be the stillness to which we can return, even if it's only very temporarily in the midst of all the chaos around it. So, yeah, being able to touch into that is a consistent theme, and to have a way of doing that, however briefly, even if it's lots of moments where that gets interrupted, it's still a reminder of the possibility that that's there, it's available. Yeah. Any other reflections anyone would like to share from the conversation? Please just feel free to raise your hand or to just speak up if you would prefer. Be nice to hear a flavour at least of some of the things that came up. Yes, Ram. Hmm. Oops, sorry, you're still muted, I think. If I send you this, maybe that will. Let's try again. That will hopefully give you a
You.
prompt. Yeah, there you go. Great.
Yeah, it was a short group. We didn't have a chance to get too much into it, but I was sharing just how my practice and teaching have changed. Um,
Hmm.
in the beginning, I used to teach a lot of philosophy. Actually, through most of the time I've been teaching, I've been also studying Advaita Vedanta through Chinmaya Mission, and I would share a lot of that in the teaching as well. But now my practice and teaching is actually more physically oriented. It's about feeling free in my body
Hmm.
and teaching my students to do that. It's about stillness and meditation and relaxation without a whole lot of philosophy. Um, and actually, it feels a lot freer that way. It doesn't feel so tied to dogma.
Hmm.
That's about it, really.
That's a great point. I'm really grateful for you raising it.
Well, for me, I love movement. I'm one of these people who kind of rare that I dream about exercising. So I get up in the morning and it's the first thing I want to do. So just feeling free in my body and then being able to relax or to sit still, to meditate afterwards, to me, it just feels great. And like I said in the comment on one of your posts earlier, maybe I'm more of a bogey than a yogi, but I kind of like it that way now.
I think that's a great thing to be. As I responded to you, I mean, I fully embrace being a bogey. There's this contrast in yogic traditions for those who aren't aware between bhoga, which is enjoyment of the world, effectively, and yoga, which is often quite renunciate and quite austere by contrast, saying enjoyment will just lead you away from liberation. But that's the word that I wanted to pick up on. You were talking about freedom and. Again, yoga traditions are always talking about freedom. And the question really is, what do we mean by being free? And it might even be enough from the point of view of maintaining some continuity of philosophy to leave it at simply asking the question, do you feel a bit more free? What does that mean for you? Let people go away and chew on that for a bit. Because there is a sort of yogic flavor of freedom. Perhaps it's a little bit different to the I don't want to get too sort of politicized in my definition of it, but in some way, I'm free to do whatever I want, and to hell with the rest of you. And I think there's something different in the yogic flavor, but it is actually just about embracing the flow of life. And something about that seems to be very consistent with some of the ideas of medieval Hatha yoga. So exploring freedom in the body as a way to be perhaps a little freed from identification with it, is a wonderful thing. So it doesn't actually even necessarily need to be leading in the opposite direction to yoga. Rudra, you also had your hand. Oh, Ram, yeah,
If
please.
I could say one more thing about that. So
Hmm.
just like in the practice of asanas, you do feel this sense of freedom and connection with your body, but then when you go into relaxation, it's almost like you leave the body behind. And so it's just, I don't know, to me it's just sort of I don't want to say magical, but just a wonderful feeling to be able to do that. And I think we can have appreciation for that without a whole lot of heavy philosophy. I mean, a little bit is okay, but sometimes it gets
Hmm.
overwhelming. Thanks.
Well, that's the thing. That's the downside to tradition. Traditions have, doctrines, and they need to be maintained. And sort of to recite what is the accepted way of seeing is part of the practice in a particular approach sometimes. And as you say, less can be more on that front. And pointing in the right direction is for many people more than enough. Um, and similarly, Kira has observed in the chat, it's nice to have these sorts of conversations without really trying to change anyone's mind. Instead, to just be open to hearing each other. And Ram acknowledged it was quite a short group session. I apologize for it being brief. That's the nature of these things. But if you would like to have longer conversations, that's kind of what I do. And there's a few people here who've done that with me over the long haul of my year-long course. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment for those who might be curious. But yeah, I think it's very important to see the possibility of listening and speaking as an aspect of yoga practice, to think about what it is to communicate in a way that is less caught up with personal identification and needing to be right and to change people's minds, and instead to just make it a field of inquiry. Maybe something interesting arises that hadn't occurred to us. Maybe it doesn't, but yeah, that's part of the freedom of a different variety. And Raphael observing freedom maybe being a bit like water for fish. You only really know what it is when it's gone. Yes, there is certainly some of that there. So perhaps part of the inquiry is also to notice its absence and what it is that enables us to do something about that. Floris, you had your hand up. I think Rudra was first, though, if I could turn to him before you. I think he had his hand up and then it went down again. So, Rudra, would you like to speak?
Hey, so
Oh, it's
yeah,
a she. I
I
apologize.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah, that's okay. Um, yeah, so I was mentioning that actually currently I'm at an Osho ashram in India, and
Hmm.
I'm here to do some movement meditations. And I have been in, like, I have been a certified instructor of yoga since 2019. But
Hmm.
one thing that I'd like to point out, especially because it's a fresh experience, is when I do these movement meditations over here, we're asked to do
Hmm.
chaotic breathing and as a form of catharsis, as a form of release of some kind of negativity or a pattern that we are attached to. Whereas yoga
Hmm.
is very methodical in its way. And one thing that hasn't changed over years, as far as I know, is the breath work. You can't be doing pranayama any other way because that would sort of defy the purpose of doing it, or that would completely reverse its effects. So it's very methodical. You can't experiment much with that aspect of yoga. You may try and experiment with the asana practice, or may add or remove some aspects of, you know, in your pedagogy of yoga, but uh, these are the basic rules of what defines yoga and pranayama, and that's what keeps it together. So that's the
Hmm.
peculiarity that I observe, especially when I'm doing something that's completely different, fairly newer than yoga, because movement meditations are fairly newer than yoga, and they're more like a combination and structured combination of sets and stages. But
Yes.
as far as yoga is concerned, Hatha Yoga or Ashtanga Vinyasa, even if it's asana heavy, you cannot sort of challenge the pranayama and the breath work.
Well, it's very interesting to observe that. And I think yeah, I would like to counter by observing that something has become part of the presentation of pranayama. Um, See you, Lizzie. Yeah, please, if you need to go, obviously that's fine. I will send a link with a recording if you want to catch the last few minutes later on. Um, and yeah, in the presentation of pranayama in modern India, one thing has come to the fore that was not actually originally identified as pranayama, kapalabhati. That was a preliminary cleansing technique in early hatha yoga. So there is some sort of fluidity around this to a certain extent. But I think you are right to notice that there is something actually disciplined and yeah, methodical about traditional yogic approaches. Of course, in the modern marketplace, people can combine and invent things in other ways and still call them yoga. What you experience in a dynamic meditation at the Osho ashram could also be branded yoga elsewhere. And I think we have to be mindful of that, that there isn't really any guarantee that anything stays aligned with particular principles. But the interesting thing is to observe that those principles might be there and to think about what it is to align with them and to see how that might then be adaptable to new situations or new techniques that could still have some of those principles in them. Floris. It looks like you might have frozen. You've gone very still. I'll come back to you in a moment. Hopefully your connection will unfreeze because it would be good to hear your thoughts. Um, in the meantime, if you'll excuse me while I am mindful of the subject, I will just quickly explain for anyone who's unfamiliar with it that I do have a longer course, and in that course we look at the whole history of yoga's evolution over the course of 20 modules. So, a 40-week process, meeting live in sessions like this to discuss things based on having in the previous 2 weeks watched a video and done some reading and done some reflecting on a few questions, some prompts for inquiry. And the whole idea of that is to do what we're doing here, to think about how the past relates to the present and how some of these older principles might be adaptable to contemporary methods, but also to observe how happy we are to a certain extent that some of those things fell out of fashion because there have been things associated with yoga over the centuries that are no longer so current, and we might not miss them. And it's interesting to see it from both directions, I think, to note the positive dimension of evolution as well as the potential drift away from core principles. And so I just wanted also to highlight, and I'll send this round with an email afterwards, that there's a special offer if you'd like to sign up before the end of the month. You can save yourself some money. And so I'll put that discount code, PATH in capital letters, _100 in the email. But just to underline what it is, I mean, I've taught in a university setting. This is not an academic course, but it does contain what you would get if you did a yoga master's degree in terms of comprehensive, very rigorous grounding in what happens at all phases of yoga history, and a familiarity with what the key scholars who are researching it have to say. But the main thing is the discussions. We're looking at how to make sense of this, how that relates to what we do, and in that sense, it's a practical engagement in philosophy. It's talking about the why, the what, and the how of yoga over its entirety of evolution, and also in its very particular location in our lives. And as you can see from this call, there's people from lots of different places, and there is something quite connected in the fact that everybody has an interest in the subject, but there is an enormous diversity of perspectives. So if that appeals, have a look at the link that I'll send around with the recording. And if you want to ask me any questions, please do feel free. But hopefully in the meantime, Floris's connection has rebooted, and he'll be able to ask the question or make the comment that he was going to do. I think he might still be there. Hopefully he is. If not, over to anyone else who might have anything that they would like to contribute before we wind down.
Quick question. How
Ivo,
many
yeah,
people
please.
stop teaching asana yoga after this course?
That's a great question. So far, to my knowledge, none. But I have come across in the university context people who gave up teaching as a result of a year or two of deep study of yoga history. And that was partly because of the way that academics tend to present this. Basically, usually trying to say everything you thought knew is wrong. And effectively, there is no one true yoga. There is also, no way of differentiating between all of these yogas. All the things that your guru and lineage may have said can't be substantiated with historical evidence, and it leaves people feeling very destabilized, unsure what the right thing to do is, and could, in some ways, have, I think, a sense that. Maybe it's easier to find some other way of doing an embodied practice than to feel like I'm doing inauthentic yoga. And so what I try to do is to take the knowledge that lies behind that sort of presentation, and reframe it in a way that's much more about yoga's a good thing. I practice yoga. I've been interested in yoga for decades now. I'm keen to help other people who want to keep practicing and teaching yoga to think about how to do it in a way that they feel comfortable with, and B, able to defend honestly, to be able to say, I teach yoga, I call it yoga, and I've thought about this a lot, and here's why. And that's what you would come out of a course like that able to do. You get a lot of opportunity to articulate yourself, and to have a clear sense of what matters to you and why. And I think that's something that's very liberating for a yoga teacher, to not be afraid of the questions from students who may have read a few memes on the internet, who suddenly come along and say, why are you calling this yoga? Or wasn't this all invented 100 years ago? Or whatever it might be. To be able to say, no, well, actually, this is why I still do what I do the way I do it, call it yoga, and feel okay with it. Kira was also asking, do you offer some of the courses individually or only through the year-long course? Yes, I have other courses on my website that look at some of the major yoga texts, the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutra, the Bhagavad Gita, the Hatha Pradipika, and the evolution of later traditions of Hatha Yoga. So yes, it's possible to engage with some of that in a shorter format. Those are 4 modules as opposed to 20. So there are other ways to do some study with me if you would like to. The only difference is those courses are based on recordings of when I held them live. So there isn't the group discussion format as part of them at the moment. I may again run them live at some point in the future. There is also, though, the possibility to, as part of a course like that, to book some one-to-one conversation with me to discuss questions if that would be helpful. Ram, you had your hand up as well.
Yes, I was just going to say you just described my situation. I quit teaching for a few years for that very reason and just
Hmm.
recently came back to it. So yeah, that's exactly it. That's all of it.
Well, I'm glad to hear you came back, and I'm glad to hear you found your own way to feel happy with what you're doing again. I think that's part of the key, really, in the end.
Yeah. Hi, this is
Yes,
Durga
Rudo.
again. Um, just to take away from, I mean, just as an extension to what you've been saying so far, about people
Hmm.
leaving their practice, is it a case of analysis paralysis when someone knows too much about something and then they can't really see what the practical side of things are, and then they need a break, and then they sort of have to suppress all the knowledge in order to be truly present and come back to it?
Well, that's a great point as well. I mean, analysis paralysis is a lovely little way of remembering that. But at the same time, I think that can also have the risk of leading us into a sort of anti-intellectual orientation, where the idea that thinking about any of this stuff and analyzing it is a waste of time. And I genuinely believe that it isn't. I think it can be, especially at a time when people are concerned about what's authentic, and particularly in the West, whether or not there's something appropriative about teaching yoga in a modern context for money. What it is to actually come back to first principles and to be a bit clearer about how that does relate to a well-established tradition of householder yoga. And that comes really from knowing what's in the texts and thinking about how we relate to them. So, on some level, some study, I think, is it's not even really optional necessarily. Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra talks about the foundation for the people who can't yet get their minds absorbed in samadhi as Kriya Yoga, tapas svadhyaya ishvara pranidhana. And svadhyaya is basically the study of sacred texts. It's the study of what will be liberating. It's what we're doing on a course like this, coming together to orient ourselves in a helpful direction. And sure, some of it will be, overwhelm, information overload, and it's up to each of us to gauge how much we want to take on board. But I think, just sort of having the idea that all information will inevitably get in the way of practice is to overlook the possibility of the insights that come from studying history, which is to get clearer about which practices have been consistently relevant throughout this cycle of evolution, and to understand actually that it might be very simple. There might be one or two things that in and of themselves are tremendously powerful. And while it might be fun to do all the other things, they might not be that necessary. So I think it is helpful sometimes to get that perspective. But you're right in the end. One of the Upanishads, the Kena Upanishad, says, the more you think you know, the more you need to find out. And if you think you know it well, you really should start reflecting on all that stuff you don't know, because there's always more to know, and we'll never know it all. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Welcome. Yep. Take care. So, anything else anyone would like to raise? I'm mindful of time. I did have in mind an hour, but I'm always happy to keep talking. Those who spend time with me on these sorts of calls will know that I never wind up exactly when I say I'm going to. So, if there is anything else you'd like to bring forward, now is the time. And yeah, I think we did lose Floris in the end, but yeah, hopefully I'll have another chance to talk to him. He's actually been on this year's course, so we will have our final seminar in a couple of weeks to talk about reflections on the year-long process. So yeah, perhaps if he did reappear, he could share one or two of those now. But otherwise, yep, we'll have to wait and see. Anything else before we wind down? Okay, then. I'm going to just then say thank you very much to those who've joined. I look forward to speaking more to a couple of those who have been on the call, who I'm going to be seeing in this year's year-long course. So we'll be starting soon. 27th of September is the first live session, so not long to wait. Yeah, whether or not it's in that format, I hope we'll have another chance to come together for a chat before too long. There will be more of these in the future, so stay tuned, and we'll be in touch. For now, take care, and I'll send you a link with the recording. Bye for now.